Welcome back, viewers and listeners, to another episode of Dudes with the Dead podcast. Thanks for joining us again for another one of our 80s special season 7.
Yeah, it's hit and miss.
Yeah, so we're continuing our journey through the 1980s with, again, so this is one that I looked up on a list of notable 1980s horror, and Return of the Living Dead came up over and over and over again. So we are going to discuss Return of the Living Dead, but first, as always, we're going to do our quick cuts. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I chose Anamorph from 2007. It's a horror thriller. Runtime is an hour and 47. IMDb is 5.4. Wait for the Rotten Tomatoes scores, 27 and 24. Now, I'm going to talk about that, though. Just really quick. It's directed by Henry Miller, starring Willem Dafoe, Scott Speedman, Clea Duvall. A psychological thriller based on the concept of anamorphosis, a painting technique that manipulates the laws of perspective to create two competing images on a single canvas. So the idea is Willem Dafoe is playing a detective who has just finished a big serial killer case, and another murder comes up that's similar in MO to the one he just finished. And they're thinking, is it a copycat? Is it the same guy? Because I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think they caught the guy. They just closed the case.
Right.
Anyway, so, and it's just that whole painting perspective thing puts a different spin on the movie. I don't think it's as bad as the Rotten Tomatoes scores myself.
What do you think accounts for the low Rotten Tomatoes score?
I don't know. I mean, I think because it's inconsistent.
Is it a slow burn? Like, is it entertaining?
I found it entertaining. I mean, Scott Speedman's character wasn't crazy about him. He wasn't a likable character. He's the partner to Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe's character, he's an interesting actor anyway, but he's definitely a little bit, what's the best word for it? He's playing this character who's, I think, been really scarred by this case that he's just done. And so he's aloof from his colleagues. And of course, if you've seen sort of police procedurals, they don't like it when they've got a lone wolf. They want everybody to be on the team.
Yeah.
Right?
Is this would you describe it as a horror film, or is it more of a procedural thriller?
Yeah, I would say so. Interesting, because I've got I'll
Those
finish.
ones always seem to walk the line.
Yes,
like
and I'll finish with this because one critic, and I think this will make sense about your question. One critic said, unfortunately, the long shadow of Fincher's Seven falls on Anamorph, and that kind of says it all.
Okay.
So they're trying to go for that feel, but they don't. It doesn't happen.
Maybe that's it. People compare it to something like Silence of the Lambs or Seven, and just doesn't deliver on the same way. I like Willem Dafoe. I always find him interesting.
Me too. And so that's the reason I watched it was he was starring. So my recommendation is, if you like Willem Dafoe and you're kind of willing, it's a really interesting concept. I really liked the idea of what they were trying to do. I don't think they stuck the landing, but I think it's worth a watch. Despite the 27-24.
So you're defying the low critic scores.
Well, IMDb was 5.4, which is reasonable for a horror film, but I wouldn't class this as a horror. They've got it as a thriller horror. So, I mean, I guess I would agree with that. But
okay. I think I'd heard of that one, but I have not seen that. So
there you go.
All right.
Put it on the list.
My quick cut is a 2024 called Daddy's Head.
I wanted to watch that for a while.
Yeah, I'd heard some buzz about this one. This is a British folk horror film directed and written by Benjamin Barfoot. The story centers on a young boy, Isaac, played by Rupert Turnbull, and his stepmother, Laura, Julia Brown, who, following the sudden death of Isaac's father, James, begins to experience unsettling events in their home. They are haunted by a grotesque creature that eerily resembles the deceased father, leading them to question their reality and safety. So Rotten Tomatoes gives this one an 85% critic score, but an audience score of 53%. And I can see that. I think it's well done. It has that kind of elevated European aesthetic, which we always talk about. Like, you can just tell. Kind of gave me like Goodnight Mommy vibes. Is that what it is? Goodnight Mommy?
Okay, yeah, it is. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, I think the characters are sort of unlikable, and it's definitely a bit of a slow burn. Like the Isaac character is pretty withdrawn and not super likable, and he's having an awkward relationship with his stepmother. But it's definitely atmospheric. It's pretty creepy and unsettling. There's a slow burn, but I think it does pay off in the end, and it's doing something kind of unique. So I thought it was good. I'd recommend it. Has some tense moments. If you're looking for just a solid horror film from 2024, that's a bit abstract, a bit out there, but pretty creepy and unique. I think you could do a lot worse than Daddy's Head.
Do you think the buzz is critic created? If the audience score is only 53 or 54% or whatever, like, what do you think accounts for the buzz then?
Yeah, I do think critically it is like it's a strong film. Like the performances are good. It's well shot. It is atmospheric. I think it's the slow burn part that probably turns off like a general audience. Yeah. But in terms of the buzz for me has come from like other podcasts saying it was like a good watch. So yeah, that's a fair question.
I mean, I've seen the buzz, read it as well. It's streaming on Shudder, I noticed.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of like Oddity or like, I don't know, just all those Scottish, Irish, English films, they just have a different feel and a different aesthetic. They're not as glossy as the Hollywood horror films.
For sure.
But they also have like an added layer of like sophistication and depth to them sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point because that's been my experience with watching European, but let's just stick to British, like Irish, Scottish, less so like UK, like England, but Irish and Scottish films. The ones that I've seen typically are a slower burn.
Yes.
And they tend to focus on story more than, flashy things going on.
That's a great characterization. Yeah. And sometimes slow burns are frustrating when it feels like they don't really pay off.
Yeah.
This one I feel like it pays off and the ending is pretty creepy.
Cool.
So yeah, I'd recommend Daddy's Head.
Nice. Okay.
All right.
I'll get into that for sure.
Okay. So pretty excited to talk about Return of the Living Dead from 1985 as our film for today.
In the dark of the night, something strange is going on.
This is a horror comedy film that follows two employees at a medical supply warehouse who accidentally release a toxic gas, reanimating the dead in a nearby cemetery. As the situation spirals out of control, a group of teenage punks and local authorities must confront the growing horde of brain-hungry zombies. This was directed by Dan O'Bannon, starring Don Calfa as Ernie, Clu Gallagher as Bert, James Karen as Frank, and Linnea Quigley as Trash, and some other,
Yeah, and a bunch of other people.
Some caricature names for a bunch of punks. This has an IMDb score of 7.3 and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 91%. Just to give a little bit of the history. So Night of the Living Dead from George A. Romero was co-written by John Russo. And so John Russo and George A. Romero got into a legal dispute. And so John Russo was allowed to use The Living Dead as part of his trilogy, or sorry, not his trilogy, like his franchise of films. Okay. So Night of the Living Dead branches off into two. So we have like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead, etc. But then we have the the Living Dead series with Return of the Living Dead 1, 2, 3. And they're doing a remake this year.
Oh, okay.
So at Christmas time, the teaser is, I think, going to be controversial.
A remake of Return?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it's called Return of the Living Dead. Originally, Toby Hooper was the one who was supposed to direct this film, but he ended up not doing it and gave it to Dan O'Bannon instead. And fun fact, the Bert part was, I guess, originally offered to Leslie Nielsen.
Oh, okay, I can see that.
Which would have been interesting. Yeah. So I've got some things to say about this film, but I'm very curious. A, what is your original context? Had you seen this one before?
Yes.
Okay, so I'd love to know about that. And B, I want to know what you thought of this one.
Okay. So before I get into that, just a quick word about Dan O'Bannon, because the name might ring a bell for some people. I think he's more known for his writing. The Carpenter film, I think it's a Carpenter film, Dark Star, and of course Alien and Aliens.
That's right. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
And I think that just lends a bit of context to who he is as a creative and kind of what he's done and what he might bring to the film. So anyway, coming back to your questions. When did I see it and what do I think about it? For sure, I saw this video rental as a younger person. I don't know if I would have seen it in the late 80s because I left Ontario and I was already in university in 85. I don't remember seeing it like around the time it was released. So I'm guessing it was late 80s I saw it. This film is a lot of fun. I went into it thinking and knowing that you could just sit back, like don't analyze, don't just watch. And I mean, the punks are ridiculous. The costumes, even some of the dialogue is pretty lame, but it's I think they're going for it's so bad it's funny or it's so over the top.
Yeah.
So, but I enjoyed it. I mean, as a departure from the more serious stuff that we do, I don't often watch these kinds of films.
Right. Okay.
So I liked it.
And do you recall when you had seen Return of the Living Dead, had you seen Night of the Living Dead first? Like, did you have that context already?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that was your original assessment and that was your assessment watching it again, but I guess that's what you were expecting.
Yeah, I don't know if it was my original, because I think I might have been a little bit more, maybe snobbish is the right word, about horror comedies. Now I'm more open-minded about it's just a fun romp. Like it's just a fun movie you can watch with friends. You can laugh. There's some gross parts, but there's also some ridiculous parts. I love the digs they get at the military and different things.
Right.
So yeah, it's just a lot of fun. I had a good time.
Okay, that's good context. So I had watched the film and I was like, that was terrible. Like I hated that movie. And then I went online and it's like 91% on Rotten Tomatoes and people are saying this is the best zombie film of all time and this is a masterpiece. And I was like, what is wrong with me? Like I thought what I just watched was ridiculous trash. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm not usually this out of touch with, like I find I'm usually somewhat in lockstep with maybe not the audience, but the critics, or if not the critics, the audience, or I can at least see where people were coming from. And in
especially
this case,
a zombie film, because I
love zombie films. And then so I was trying to think like why, like maybe when you're used to like the sadness in 28 Days Later and Dawn of the Dead remake. But I think the thing I love about zombie films is the characters and like the interplay of how those characters respond in a zombie apocalypse. And here you're just left with a bunch of ridiculous caricatures.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I was really caught off guard that within like the first 10 minutes, there's this group of teenage punks and one of them's doing a striptease on top of a gravestone.
You got to love the 80s for the TNA that they put in anywhere they can.
Yeah. And and even like the film starts with like, this is based on true events.
I love that. The events portrayed in this film are all true. The names are real names of real people and real organizations.
Right. So obviously, you know that what they are trying to, like, they're not taking themselves seriously. So I actually went and watched it again.
Wow.
Right afterwards. Because I was like, okay, I need to go into this film with a different mindset. And clearly, as you say, this is meant to be just a fun.
Yeah.
But in some of the reviews and some of the things people were saying about it was how like how good the acting was and how good the characters were and like what this says about like the pain of people trying to survive in an apocalypse with the guys like being in pain. And I could not take anyone seriously. I did not care about any of the characters. Granted, it is kind of funny. And I find this is a personal issue with me. I struggle with genres that kind of borderline, especially with comedy, like dramedies, or I don't mind some horror comedies, but I think you have to either be a full-blown comedy where it's so funny that I'm enjoying it on a comedic level.
Yeah.
Because when you have some comedy, to me, that just takes away any tension or any fear or any scare factor because I didn't care about the characters because they were ridiculous. Like the lines that come from like the suicide guy or whatever, it's a lifestyle or I don't know. I didn't care if they died and I wasn't invested. I wasn't scared. There were individual elements of the film that I liked, but it's kind of baffling to me that this film has 91% and that people speak of it as if it's one of the best zombie films of all time. But maybe it is just my mental disconnect.
Well, I mean, I can't get on board with this is the best zombie film of all time because of the horror comedy. I would only say that it's a fun watch if you have low expectations. Like I knew going in that I wasn't expecting Academy performances.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I noticed, when you've got characters, I don't know if you notice this, there's Bert and Ernie.
I was wondering about Bert and Ernie. And Ernie's like a neo-Nazi who has like pictures of Eva Braun and Hitler, and he pulls out a German Luger. I'm like, what is going on here? And Bert and Ernie,
it's just it's so over the top. Some of the stuff. I don't know how you could take it seriously. And we've talked about this many times. I'm on the same page with respect to horror comedies. It's very difficult to walk that line. I think Werewolves Within is a recent one that I felt walked that line well.
Yeah. I think Scream actually has some comedy and it kind of walks that line. But I think Scream has better characters. Yeah, and it has that whodunit murder mystery thing. Whereas when you watch Scary Movie, it's not meant to be enjoyed on any horror level. It's pure comedy. I can get behind the pure comedies as well. For me, I maybe what I look for in a zombie film is not yucks. I like the tension and the character and the choices and the dynamics. It's hard to argue with your perspective because I feel the same way that particularly the zombie genre, because you and I, but because there's been so many good ones, and legit horror films, it's a little bit like, I think I wouldn't class this. I would say this is a comedy, not a horror. There's just splashes of horror stuff and like gross things thrown in, but it never achieves a level of tension or scare that I would consider to be a horror film. Yeah, and do you attribute that to the characters or the lack of character? They're all caricatures in my mind. Absolutely. The characters are only there to serve the movement of the plot. All they do is move things forward because they change location or they introduce a new character like the Undertaker or whatever. Yeah. But other than that, I agree with you 100%. The characters are ridiculous. And as a zombie fan, I feel like the thing that draws me to the zombie subgenre is the idea that the zombies are background and they are backdrop to highlight differences in characters and differences in their morality or how they see the world. And so just having a red-haired punk stripping on a grave pole or like the big suicide guy just lumbering around with his mohawk. I don't know. It was really... So I'm guessing the second watch didn't improve your... It did perception? A little bit. Like I did, I was trying to look at it, like you were saying, like just have fun with it, just enjoy it on a comedic level. And yeah, it was a little bit more enjoyable. Like the practical effects are very good. Yes. Like the Tar Man zombie, like the one who's been around for like... He looks really good. And the way he moves is very like unnatural and unsettling. And I like that. But in terms of enjoying any of the characters or any of the dialogue, I don't think that did anything for me. Here's a great example of caricature. One of the punks, somebody's making fun of his outfit or whatever. Exactly. It's not a costume, it's a way of life. Yeah. How can you take a movie seriously that puts out lines like that? You're just like, okay, that was so ridiculous. But that's a great example. I think the puns and the one-liners, I think at one point make a reference to Night of the Living Dead. They do. That are at the beginning when at the table, he actually says like, oh yeah, like, have you heard of Night of the Living Dead? Yes, that's right. Those zombies, so you can tell it's not really taking itself seriously. No, not at all. Even like quips like, does he say, these don't leak. They were made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then it just leaks. Those kinds of things. That's why I say it operates absolutely on a comedic level. And to me, the horror bits are just little splashes thrown in, so that maybe they can, call it a hybrid. The practical effects are good and whatever, and there's some like kind of gross stuff, but to me, it's just a comedy about zombies. And this seems to be maybe one of the trappings of 1980s horror and why I've always struggled with it a little bit. So I went onto a list like best 80s horror. Yep. And Return of the Living Dead is there over and over and over again. But I don't like a film that's this ridiculous. I wouldn't expect to see on like a best of the decade. Like, is there something about 80s horror that has more sense of fun or is less serious than, let's say, the last decade, where if you were to look at the top 10 films of the 2010s, it's Hereditary, it's, very serious, like The Conjuring, Sinister.
Yeah.
So they're very dark, they're very serious, and they're very scary. And I feel like the 1980s just doesn't have the same volume of those, and they tend to have more horror films like this.
I think you're right. I think the 80s had more horror comedies. I mean, look, Toxic Avenger, this one. Chopping Mall. Yeah, like there's Slumber Party Massacre, Sorority House Massacre. Like there are a whole bunch of things, and I think, and I'm not an expert on 80s horror, but it seems to me as a horror fan, what the 80s did was take a lot of the exploitation films of the 70s and then add elements of comedy. Because all of those films, although like Sorority House, Slumber Party, those are more of a horror film, but there's all funny stuff in there too. Like there's a little quips, there's little one-liners. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's accurate, but I would certainly agree that the 80s didn't have the same seriousness of horror as current decade for sure.
Which is so funny because you and I have commented in the past that I actually tend to like the fun romps more than you do, I think. But I think I just came into this one not expecting that.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that's sometimes what happens is if you come in thinking, okay, this is going to be this kind of film, and then it messes with your expectations, it's hard to recalibrate sometimes where you go, but that's not what I expected or wanted or whatever, right?
And even in terms of the horror, like in the first 5 minutes, when that green body paint naked dude comes running out of the closet and tackles them, he looks ridiculous. And they're like cutting his head off and he's still getting up and moving around. And there's like that half a dog that's been cut in half and it's like squirming around. The guy's like beating it with a broom. Like it just is comical.
Yeah.
Like nothing about that to me was scary. I just thought it was funny, which is fine.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, with the Mortician, the whole Luger thing, and he's got there's German march music playing in the background and stuff. I don't know if you noticed Freddy's jacket on the back says F you.
Yes, I did notice that.
Which was, I mean, I remember those satin baseball jackets. I remember that some of those fashions. Yeah, absolutely.
So apologies to viewers and listeners who love this film. If you covet this film as like, this is the 1980s. I think I do get it. And I recognize there's definitely some historical significance in terms of the zombie subgenre, like just the idea that this is the reason why zombies want brains. Whereas in Night of the Living Dead, they're just eating any kind of body part, but we tend to associate zombies with wanting to eat brains, and that's because of this film. Yeah. So I get that there's like some groundbreaking things in terms of the evolution of the zombie, but just in terms of like an enjoyable film. And I think I just went into it with the wrong expectations.
Yeah, fair. I mean, because and this is a definite turnaround for us because typically I would have your
I know we almost did a 180 here.
But I think so you hadn't seen this?
No.
Okay.
I think I'd actually seen Return of the Living Dead 2.
Okay.
In elementary school though, so I had no.
So I think that's the difference is that I had a frame of reference and I knew that this wasn't.
Well, I think I had known too that the guy, that John Russo,
right,
who was associated with the first Night of the Living Dead and George A. Romero. So I think I just expected something a little more of a serious zombie film.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough, right? I mean, there's some really good, like you said, the practical effects are really good. There's one scene where they do a dolly zoom, and it's Freddy's girlfriend sees a zombie in the basement.
Yes.
And for those of you who don't know, a dolly zoom is when the camera's zooming forward, but the cameraman or camera person is moving backwards. So you have this, there's the best example I can think of is in Jaws. If you've seen Jaws, and Roy Scheider is on the beach and he sits up because he thinks he sees a shark, and you have this it's a very strong effect. And I really liked, I mean, the performances are so camp. The music is brutally bad. Like those 80s synth scores are just horrible. It makes me cringe. And
And the tone of the music too is more goofy.
Yeah, goofy.
I think. Yeah,
for sure. And I mean, even things like I guess they're just poking fun at all of those kinds of movies where, like the RMTs show up and then they die and they send out another crew of RMTs.
Send more paramedics.
Like
even just the idea of having talking zombies too was like, I don't know if I like zombies that talk.
Yeah, because they're almost like a Frankenstein kind of thing, like orally when they talk. It's almost like that, beast mode kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, I had a question here for you. Although I agree with you, the practicals are pretty good. There's definitely some rubber-looking corpses and things. And do you think that was intentional, or it was just a limitation of the time?
Yeah, that's true. I think it's fair to say that the practicals were imbalanced. There's also the famous, like the skull. There's one point that's like a zombie head, which apparently everyone on set thought was terrible. And people make fun of it. Yeah. It's like you can actually see like some of the like the metal rods and stuff in the back. So in that case, those are not good practical effects.
No.
But then the Tarman zombie I thought looked really good. So yeah. So sorry, what was your question?
Well, my question was, I mean, some of the inconsistency of the practicals. Aside from obvious things where you think I don't think they meant to do that. I wondered, and maybe I'm just giving them too much credit. I wondered if
it was on purpose.
It was on purpose to kind of raise up the camp level.
Right. Yeah, my understanding was no from like the things that I watched on it, that they were just imbalanced. Yeah. I don't know what their budget was like, but I mean,
I liked Darrow Chemical. I'm assuming is a Dow Chemical reference.
I mean, the idea that how relentless the zombies are is kind of unnerving and frightening. The idea that even when you cut them up, any individual limb is animated and trying to come after you. So they are, if done in a serious way, actually might be more scary. Yeah. Right? That you can't just shoot a zombie and it's dead. But like if you saw its arm off, its arm is going to come after you. Like I thought that was kind of neat. Yeah. There's that part when they have the bags, the garbage bags. Yes. And like they're each all moving independently of each other. That was cool.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And I thought
there was lots of good ideas.
Yes.
But I just didn't appreciate the campy tone, I suppose.
I mean, the idea of burning the bodies I liked, because the idea of just shoot them in the head. That I don't know that, and maybe they were just looking for something different. I mean, the only one I sort of questioned was when, and I can't remember the character's name, but he's one of the main characters, when he cremates himself.
Yes.
He gets into, and I'm like, okay, sorry, I'm going to draw the line.
He puts the wedding ring on the,
yeah. I mean, and fair enough, right? Like, I mean, it was just, all of it's meant to be ridiculous and goofy. And I think the woman that strips down, she goes through most of the film with very little clothing on. Like you see her,
even as a zombie, I think
And I was just like, okay, well, I guess that's your way of, pleasing teenage boys who might come to see this. But was it rated R? I wonder.
I imagine it would have to be.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Anyway.
Actually, you know what? Was it this film? I feel like I was watching something where it originally wasn't rated R, but they no, this has to be rated R.
Oh,
so
okay.
We want you to up the rating.
Oh, okay.
So, but I forget if it was for this film or not, but I think it was.
Because that's ringing a bell for me, but not for this film. That they were going for a higher rating than what they were given, which is not usually the case because they're usually, removing things, trying to get a reasonable rating. Yeah. And that's, we've not talked a lot about this, and we obviously don't have to go on for too long about this, but I think that's one of the challenges of making good film. And I'll speak about horror film, because if you go for the PG rating and you've got a larger audience, ostensibly, it means you're limited to what you can show and do on screen. I mean, the flip side is when you go for an R rating, you limit your audience, but you have more freedom in terms of what you can do for that audience.
Although ironically, sometimes I feel that makes some films better because they can't show it. They have to leave it to the imagination of the viewer. Sometimes that actually makes it for a better film.
Fair play, yeah.
But yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think typically horror fans like it when they're not holding back for that, especially for that reason.
Yeah, exactly.
If you have an artistic reason for not wanting to show it, that's one thing. But if you're just trying to get more butts and seats to make more money, that's kind of.
I mean, I won't spoil it now, but one of the movies later on in our list, that's one of my big complaints about it is that it's too PG.
Oh, I know which one you're talking about. I think. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is I think the director was manipulated to have his film be a certain way.
Interesting.
By the producer of the film. Sorry, I just don't want to spoil a film we're going to talk about later. And the movie is very good, but it could have been better if they had been allowed to go that extra mile for some of the scares.
Yeah.
But I think the producer has a reputation that he didn't want spoiled. So I think, and I haven't read anything to this effect, but knowing the director's other films, I can't believe he made those choices.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll have a fuller discussion about that later.
But I didn't get the sense they were holding back for any of those reasons.
Yeah, okay.
But there are a few deaths where a character is just enveloped by a crowd of zombies and they don't show anything and there isn't much practicals. Yeah. But then there's other examples where they clearly put a lot of effort into like the makeup and the seeming like animatronics or whatever they used. But
I mean, I think that's for most movies, unless you've got an unlimited budget, which is unusual. What was I was watching something recently about, and I don't know if it's a movie we're going to do. So, and I can't even think of the name anyway, but they went, I think, triple over the amount of, I know what it was, Exorcist. It was supposed to be an 85-day shoot. And they went like 230 days or something, way over budget, way over their allotted time. But the difference was, if you look at sort of early 70s, because that was 73 they were filming, the studio was just shoveling money at the director and really didn't call him on any, just let him do what he wanted to do. And I don't think that's a very common thing in the history of film, but I don't think it's a very common thing now. Having an unlimited budget, unless you're in a Marvel film.
I was going to say, maybe for a Marvel film, but.
So we've talked about performances. We've talked about, I talked about music, which I thought was horrible. You talked about practicals. Was there anything that you did like about the film?
Yeah, so things I said I liked. The Tarman zombie, I thought looked really good. I did mention the practical effects. One thing which is I didn't give it credit for the first time I watched it, but the idea that the zombies here kind of run.
Yes. They move faster than Night of the Living Dead for sure.
That's right. So it's not the full on like sprinting zombies you get in 28 Days Later. When I think of running zombies, these ones don't quite get there.
Yeah.
But it's fair that they're not shambling zombies.
No.
And they do kind of overwhelm you pretty quickly, and they do have a good clip. So that's interesting. Like, again, if we're talking about like the historical significance of this film and evolving the zombie subgenre, the idea that they eat brains, but also the idea that they can move a little faster makes them more intimidating, I think.
Now, so Night of the Living Dead is 68, 69. Romero does other like follow-up films in the 70s.
Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah.
And my understanding is Day of the Dead came out the same summer as this one.
Okay.
So they were like directly competing with each other. For you, was there any competition between the Night of the Living Dead, like George Romero's branch of the genre, and this one?
Not really. I mean, I prefer, like, if you think of...
Have you seen 2 and 3?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, of this one?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, I've seen 2 and 3, ironically, and not this one.
I mean, I think, is it Dawn where they're in the shopping mall?
That's right.
So I prefer that level. I wouldn't call that a horror comedy. No. But there are elements of comedy in that, in a
especially in the remake.
Yes. Yeah. But even the first one
has some.
There are elements of that, and I prefer that where there's tension and scares and the horror tropes, but you have these odd one-liners or things to kind of lighten the tension.
Totally, I'm good with that.
Yeah. The reason I asked the question was I was trying to put it in context of, okay, when did this happen in terms of that whole? Because to be honest, I'm a little bit confused about who did what and what happened when
Yeah,
in
no,
terms
that's
of Romero and other ones.
Yeah, so there's Night of the Living Dead and then Dawn of the Dead, which was the mall one.
Yeah.
And then Day of the Dead came out around the same time as this one.
Okay.
So they are kind of competing with each other. Day of the Dead is a bit controversial.
Yeah.
But I like it. Do you like that one in the military complex with the Yeah. I think you're right. It's just about having the right mindset for this film. If you were to sit down with friends on a Friday night and just have a good time and laugh along with a movie, like this movie has value in that regard.
I think particularly, I mean, generationally, we're, 17 or 20 years apart. If you grew up in the 80s and you haven't seen this film, I would encourage you to see the film, because the fashions, the hairstyles, some of the dialogue even, it's a bit of a trip down memory lane. I mean, I wasn't a punk. I knew people in my high school that looked like that.
Okay, that's good context.
So the soap in your hair to have it stand up, liquid paper, and or white paint, but a lot of times it was just liquid paper, and they would, put things on their leather jackets or whatever, and the chains and all. And when the guy said, it's not a costume, it's a way of life, what I found so funny about that is that was kind of the attitude of some of the punks I knew. It's like, well, this is just how I live, and it's like, okay, whatever. And I would love to see, there's one person in particular that I won't say a name about, but we were very good friends in elementary school. And then we became estranged. He was in my high school though. And I saw him make this transition into a punk. Anyway, I just think the punk thing really did it for me, because I just found that so funny and so ridiculous, grounded in what was happening around the world.
Yeah.
At least in Western cultures. I don't know. It's this 80s thing has been really interesting for me because I wouldn't go back and rewatch these films if I wasn't doing this. Changeling, like some of the more serious ones, maybe. These ones, it's like, I've seen it once, I'm good.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to go back and kind of analyze and go, okay, what were they doing well? And of course, in the moment, I saw many of these films around the 80s or when I was in high school or whatever. And
if you want to feel nostalgic for the 80s, this is probably a good one to watch,
sure.
right? Like The Changeling, though it's technically a 1980s film, doesn't really feel like 80s horror to me, but this like almost seems like a prototypical example
Absolutely.
of this is a time capsule to go back and see what like 80s horror was like. So I appreciate that it would have that quality. And if you have fond memories of that time period, and if you loved 80s horror, then I can see why people look fondly upon this movie. Yeah,
and that's kind of where I was going with that too, 100%. Like I think maybe some of the positive ones are, people my age, in their mid-late 50s who grew up watching this stuff, and they go, oh yeah, that was so funny. I remember that. Because on a Friday night with, a bunch of guys from high school, popcorn and stuff, this would have been a fun romp to watch. Because sometimes the serious ones I didn't find in a group watch I didn't like it, because not everybody was a horror fan, and some people would poke fun at certain things or whatever. And if it's a serious horror film, I kind of want it still and quiet, and I want to pay attention.
And this probably would have been so fun to see like in a movie theater.
Yeah, 100%.
With people like rooting and cheering, and when she's dancing and they're headless zombies running around chasing people. So did but would you recommend this to a modern horror fan?
I would struggle to do that.
Like Creepshow, it's almost like if you have nostalgia for this time period and that an 80s horror, then yes. But if you're used to watching Talk to Me and Hereditary and The Substance, then you go watch Return of the Living Dead. I feel like it might be rough.
And the challenge with this one is I don't think it's kid appropriate, unlike Creepshow, which I think you could get away with a younger audience, right?
Good point.
This one,
you don't think the striptease in the graveyard would be kid appropriate?
I don't. I just think there's more. There are some adult themes in Creepshow, but I think this one is more of a teenager adult kind of film. So I agree with you. I think it would be really hard if you don't have a broad watching background. you probably wouldn't enjoy this very much unless you're going into it knowing, but even the comedy doesn't really stand up to current comedy, right?
That's maybe why I struggle with it a little bit, because I like horror comedies and I don't mind them being ridiculous and funny, but I feel like this one walked too much in the middle where it wasn't like out loud, like laugh out loud funny enough to be a full blown comedy, but the goofiness took away from the tension in the horror. So it just ended up feeling like a bit of a ridiculous
Agreed.
romp.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Yeah, it's funny because I had a little note to myself about the half dog and the fresh cadavers.
Actually, I have to say we haven't done spoilers yet. I like the ending.
Okay.
But I guess there won't be too much to talk about. I think it's
No, so should we head into spoilers then?
Sure. Yeah. So final recommendation.
No.
Yeah. So I appreciate some of the historical significance of this film in terms of evolving the zombie subgenre. As a zombie fan, I can get behind those things. But do I recommend you run out and watch this? I think I would have to say no as well.
Yeah. I mean, it might seem ironic that I spoke positively of it, but I don't think a modern viewer would enjoy this very much.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. Like if you're a zombie fan, if you're a fan of the zombie subgenre and you care about the history, then I think this is an important film. I can recognize that and I agree with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't really enjoy it.
Fair. Okay. So spoilers?
Spoilers.
Okay.
So I just had an upcoming thing spoiled for me.
Okay, go ahead, because you had some things you wanted to say.
Yeah, so I kind of like the bleak ending though, with the military just deciding to like nuke the town. That kind of worked for me. This film seems to have some social commentary, maybe about the military.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you not like the ending?
No, I thought it was good too.
Okay, yeah. So I would have much preferred this than they all somehow
absolutely
survive and have a happy ending of some kind. So that worked for me. I was interesting too. I guess the Beverly Randolph, the girl who plays Tina.
Okay.
So I'd heard that she actually had a horrible time on this set. And there's scenes where she's crying, where I guess in real life she was crying. And there's a notable scene where she runs up the stairs. And you remember where she trips and falls?
Yes.
So they sawed that step and they didn't tell her.
Oh, man.
But apparently everyone else on set knew. So when she came out, people were avoiding eye contact and she could tell there was like a weird... And then when she ran out, because she really hurt herself.
Yeah.
So there was some pretty nasty stuff done by the team, I guess.
Now, was that the kind of thing where the director was trying to get a reaction? I
don't think it was meant to be mean-spirited as like a prank on her. I think they were looking, but still, I mean, that when you see it happen, it almost looked like it really would have hurt.
Yeah.
And I guess there's maybe some misogynistic things happening with the at least one of them, I think, was a stripper, but it might have been not the one who does the dance on the step, but the other girl who's trapped with that other guy. And she keeps saying, I don't like you, but I'm stuck with you.
Right,
she like blue hair.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's that element. I didn't look too much into that, but certainly that was pretty crazy that they would do that without telling her.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, you could get a severe break of something falling through a stair like that if your body moved the wrong way.
Oh, not expecting it?
Yeah. I mean, and that could be like, I'm talking bone through the skin break. Like, I think that could be very horrific if you ended up, your body fell the wrong way, but your leg was caught in the stair. That would be ugly.
Yeah, like speaking of The Exorcist, that's like a freaking kind of move.
Yeah, I was going to say, because that's why I asked the question, because having just watched, there's a recent documentary, 2024, probably, I haven't seen it until like this week, but it probably came out in response to Exorcist Believer. Mm-hmm. And of course, they mentioned that they do a fairly long interview with Ellen Burstyn, and she tells that story again where, Friedkin basically okayed her being injured so that he could get, and I don't know if in older documentaries, if she's this forthright, but in this one, she said, I was absolutely furious when I was laying on the ground, because not only did he get the stuntman to pull harder, but he zoomed the camera in and she could see him directing the cameraman. She was on the floor writhing in pain and he wanted to get that on film.
Yeah.
So she was livid with him. But you know, the funny thing is, almost everybody that they talked to praised Friedkin for that type of behavior because he was so willing to go to certain lengths to get what he wanted to get. And I just don't think you could do that anymore.
No, that's very highly unethical. And I don't know if that happens in other genres, but unfortunately, I've only really heard stories of that from the horror subgenre. But maybe it did happen in other. I guess there's not many other genres though where you're hoping to get that.
Yes.
Elicit a horrific response from a character.
I mean, it might be a war movie, but you wouldn't be messing with like live ammunition or, you know, anything stupid like that.
Yeah. Unless you're, what's his name?
Anything else for spoilers? I don't really have anything spoiler wise. I think I said everything I wanted to say, but
well, that's just it, right? It's so ridiculous that.
I mean, the whole thing could be a spoiler if you start talking about, oh, they did this and they did this.
So what's your reaction to the send more paramedics? Like, is that just something, enjoy it?
Well, I mean, it was stupid, but it's stupid in the context of a silly film. So it works, right? Yeah. Because you're just like, okay, that's ridiculous. But it's no more ridiculous than all the other things that go on, like a stripper in a and who goes to party in a
just it in a graveyard.
In a graveyard, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if you're a punk and you're badass hardcore, you think I'm going to go party but I doubt it. I don't know. So I didn't have a reaction. I just went with the flow on that. Well, it didn't bother me one way or the other, but I didn't think it was a good thing. I just didn't think about it at all.
Yeah.
I think.
I like the butterflies too when everything's being animated.
Oh yeah.
And you see the butterflies all coming back to life too. It has some good ideas. It has some, it was a tonal disconnect for me, but
yeah, fair.
As a fun romp, I can't really knock it. So, because clearly it's self-aware.
Absolutely.
With the whole everything in this movie is absolutely true, and the reference to Night of the Living Dead, and the striptease in the graveyard, like no one does that. Trying to make a serious horror film.
Yeah,
So.
Yeah, exactly. None of those things happen if you're trying to approach the genre with some verisimilitude. Did I get that right?
Verisimilitude.
Yeah. Anyway.
Glad I watched it. It was as a zombie fan, it seemed like something that had to be watched at some point. So is that it?
That's it. That's all I got to say.
All right. Well, thank you for watching, and
we'll see you in the aisles.